Hey guys, Jay here. So today I'm here to tell you my experiences using the Gustard X26 Mark III streaming DAC and a few tips and tricks I found along the way to get the most out of it. I've heard a lot of praise for Gustard products in my comment section, so I was particularly interested in checking this one out. And honestly, after checking out the Gustard X26 Mark III, I can fully understand where they're coming from. There's a lot to love about the X26 Mark III. In a nutshell, this Gustard is a DAC first streamer, meaning that this is mainly a DAC with a very simple streaming capabilities. So unlike most streamers these days where you have to download the dedicated app from the company, so I have a lot of apps to download when I'm doing these reviews, the Gustard doesn't have its own app. Instead, it allows you to use other third-party popular protocols and apps like Rune, UPnP, AirPlay, and so on instead. Now, this may limit you in terms of the software that you use if they don't support it, for example, like Amazon Music, for example, but that can be configured through UPnP, Rune, and so on. But it does have limitations because it doesn't come with its own app. But I personally found it refreshing that I didn't personally have to download yet another app for this review. I mainly used AirPlay through the Tidal app to stream through this unit, and I personally loved how flawless and easy and intuitive it was to use. Like I said, the main focus of this unit is the DAC, and it uses two flagship DAC chips from Sabre, ES9039S Pro DAC chip. Now, there are a few interesting advantages that comes with this new DAC chip, but one of the main things and most of the kind of advantages that comes with it is because it's an 8-channel DAC chip. Now, we've seen this before in the Go Stellar DAC, which was a octo DAC that used a 8-channel chip from Sabre to effectively parallel the channels to reduce distortion. And it is an effective way to actually reduce distortion by paralleling multiple DACs or multiple channels. So that's what PS Audio did for their $4,000 DAC. And it was using the ESS9038 Pro DAC chip. Now, what's interesting is that inside this Gustard DAC that costs only $1,600, which is less than half the price of the Go Stellar, is using the most latest chip. So the upgraded chip from the one that PS Audio is using, which again is the 9039S Pro. But as if that wasn't enough, instead of using a single chip, it's using two chips, one per channel, effectively making this DAC, I guess, a hexa-deca DAC. But of course, the DAC chip itself is only part of the story, and how it's implemented is a differentiating factor from a good DAC to an exceptional one. And for under $2,000, I think the implementation here by Gustard is quite respectable. I'll go for us to say it is hard to not be impressed. Firstly, they are using two separate linear power supplies with two toroidal transformers, one for the digital and one for the analog, totally separate. Second, we have the Gustard's high performance clock and also the option of using an external 10 MHz clock of your choice if you choose to. Third, we have the Class A discrete circuitry by Gustard for the output section. And I have to say, I'm particularly happy to see a discrete circuitry instead of an integrated circuit inside a DAC that costs less than $2,000. On top of that, I do like the clean layout and a very well thought out one at that. And talking about the things that's well thought out, the internals are not the only thing that's well thought out. The functionality and the features of this unit is very well thought out, and I found it very easy and intuitive to use because of that. Many DACs these days do come with the preamp capability where you can attenuate the signal to effectively plug it directly into an amplifier and to be used as a volume adjustment. And that's no exception with the Gustard. It has that capability, effectively allowing you to control the volume from the unit. It can be adjusted from negative 90 dB to 0 dB, but as always, I would highly recommend using a separate solo standalone preamplifier or the preamplifier built into your integrated amplifier instead, if those are better choices. Usually the preamplifier, the digital preamplifier with these kind of units is not my personal favorite. I think they are mediocre at best. But in Gustard's case, it's actually better than a lot of the ones that I had tested before. So I'll give them that. Now, to actually use a separate preamplifier or the preamplifier inside your integrated amplifier, you would have to set the DAC to a fixed output. And to do this, normally on even very intuitive units like the Ever Solo, you would have to go into the settings and make the output volume pass through or fixed or whatever. And this was another step that you had to do Well, in Gustard's case, it's the most intuitive it can possibly get. You increase the volume all the way up to 0 dB, and then you press one more step, and then it becomes fixed. So to effectively exit the fixed mode, all you have to do is now decrease the volume, and it exits the fixed mode, and it's back to being a preamplifier, which is the most intuitive and the simple way I've seen someone or a company do this. And I think a lot of companies should adopt and take notes on this because it's the most easiest way possible. And it's a little thing, but it goes a long way. This unit also lets you choose from a plethora of digital input options to connect this unit to a separate source like a TV, dedicated streamer, or a CD transport, etc. And the short pressing of the gear button allows you to change between these different input settings. So you can have your TV, CD player, streamer, multiple units connected, and you can just switch it from the Gustard depending on what you are doing at that point in time. For example, you can use something like the optical input for something like your TV, whereas you can use the other inputs for things like your CD player, streamers, and so on, more serious dedicated listening to music kind of devices. Although these digital inputs do have a pretty high sampling rate of up to DSD over PCM64, and all inputs are MQA compatible, if you're a particular fan of higher sampling rates, like all the way up to DSD 512 for example, then you would want to stick with the USB and the I2S connection. Also, if you're a fan of upsampling from the streamer or your source to feed it to your DAC, then again, the USB and the I2S is the best choice here. And if you're a particular fan of the I2S connection, it would make sense to use the Gustard DAC here with streamers like the Eversolo DMP-A8 that has an I2S digital output, or CD transports like the Shenling ET3 or the new Shenling Onyx SA CD player with the I2S connections. Also, much like the Live Harmony DAC, the Gustard has 4 different modes for the I2S configuration. Depending on the brand, they may use different configurations, so Gustard allows for that flexibility in case you want to use a different configuration from a different brand. And this setting, as well as plethora of other settings, can be found when you long press the gear button on the OLED touchscreen display or by pressing menu on the remote. Notably, the filters are what most people will be interested in. First, we have the NOS mode, which you can enable or disable. Keep in mind that when you enable the non-oversampling mode, it does exactly that. It doesn't oversample, so whatever filters does not apply, it bypasses it straight to the DAC chip. Second will be the PCM filters. We have Vivid, Gentle, and Composite. Personally for me, the effects of these filters are pretty subtle, but there are differences. The Vivid and the Gentle is quite similar and it's hard to tell them apart, but the Composite, which was my favorite setting, does have a little bit more defined edges and defined imagery, which I personally liked. Third, we also have the DSD bandwidth filters. You get 4, and as the number increases, you get more bandwidth. Again, personally for me, the effects were subtle, even more subtle than the PCM filters with the DSD filters. Now, I will say that it added more air and kind of spaciousness around instruments and so on when I went to higher DSD filter settings. But for the most part, like I said, the effects were subtle and I really didn't stick with one filter. It was easy enough to kind of go back and forth between many different filters. So I kind of went with whatever I personally found to sound good with a certain track for this one. It was pretty easy to do on the fly. Now, to connect the Gustard unit to a solo amplifier or integrated amplifier, it has both RCA and XLR outputs, which is super neat. Now, like I said, I prefer to use this unit as a standalone DAC to an integrated amplifier that has its own preamplifier capability instead of using a solo amplifier with preamplifier capability of the Gustard. So for me, I used the Accuphase E3000 integrated amplifier. And the speakers I was running were my main speakers. I tried many other different speakers as well, but this was the main one that I used for the majority of the listening session. And that was the Platimon VC1 with the VC2 extension module. With the AMT tweeter and the Beryllium Super Tweeter, like I said, these speakers can be extremely revealing of the components you put behind them. And I was quite impressed with how good the setup sounded. First of all, overall, I would describe the sound characteristic of this DAC to be neutral with a hair of warmth and smoothness. Now, I have to be completely honest here, I was a little bit biased going into this because I knew that it had a Sabre DAC chip inside, and my experiences with past DACs that have Sabre DAC chips tended to be that it sounded too analytical or too clinical for my liking. And while this DAC is a very detailed DAC, very, very detailed DAC, it shows all the nuances and details that you would ever want, it is not necessarily a clinical sounding DAC. It may be an analytical sounding DAC, but it sounds natural. It doesn't sound brittle or sharp or, for the lack of better words, digital. It sounds smooth, warm, with a lot of detail without being overly clinical or stripped of life. So I really appreciated that. And if you didn't tell me that this was using a Sabre DAC chip, I would have not really known. Because like I said, it doesn't have that kind of characteristic that I don't like about Sabre DAC chips. And the other personal issue I have with Sabre DAC chip based DACs in general has been that some of them can sound too lean, too thin, which I particularly do not like. Now this DAC, I wouldn't call it muscular or, very, very full sounding in the mid-range, but it's full enough. It's a nice balance between being detailed and having that kind of precise imagery and defined edges, and smoothness and muscularity and that boldness in the mid-range. It's a nice balance. So even in that way, I would say that this DAC is pretty neutral. Now what this DAC does share with a lot of Sabre DAC chip-based DACs is that pitch dark background. So it has a very dark background. It's a very, very quiet DAC, which allows me to appreciate the details even more. But again, in a natural, unbright, very easygoing way. And this was particularly great for those long listening sessions at night, right? When I'm not sleeping and listening to some music at lower volumes to not bother my neighbors. I could hear all the little details and textures. It was very pleasant. But in the morning, in the daytime, when I crank up the volume to rocking levels, I was pleasantly surprised that it didn't fall apart like a lot of the Sabre DAC chip-based DACs did for me in the past. So the sound was still natural, sound was still not brittle, sound was still not bright or fatiguing to listen to, even at cranking volumes. The soundstage is pretty wide and pretty deep for a DAC of using a Sabre DAC chip. I think it's a definite step up from something like an SMSL or a topping DAC that uses Sabre DAC chips in the past. I think the soundstage is more open, more spacious, and more in line with some of the R-Tour DACs that I personally experienced. For example, the Pontus 15th, which is about $2,000 US. Now keep in mind that the Pontus 15th is now less warm than the previous generations and is more detail oriented, much like the Venus. And I bring this up because the overall kind of detailedness of the sound was similar, but there were two main key differences that I did find. For one, I still did prefer the Pontus in terms of the layering and the sound staging, but again, we are splitting hairs here. And two, I did find the Gustard to be slightly warmer and slightly more forgiving, less sharp around those edges, especially at higher volumes. Compared to my recent favorite, the Live Harmony R2R DAC, which cost about $1,000 more than the Gustard, I found that the Live Harmony was more to my liking in terms of its tonality. It's richer sounding, more full, more bold sounding. And I really like the soundstage and the layering of the Live Harmony more. But I did find the Gustard to have a more defined imagery with a more detailed sound. And something I would categorize as more of a neutral presentation, neutral sound, is definitely more the Gustard. So again, we're kind of comparing apples to oranges here in this case. However, I did think it was an upgrade from the DAC inside the Eversolo DMP A6 or even the DMP A8. And I did think it was a worthy upgrade from the Topping D70 budget Octo DAC. Although I did really love that DAC for being $600 for that kind of performance and it's really detailed and really nice, I did find the Gustard to be more natural sounding and more quality put into the components inside and out. And also the features were just more top-notch compared to the Topping D70 Octo. So I think it was a definite upgrade from something like that. Now, is the Gustard 3 times as good as the Topping D70 Octo? No, I don't think so. But it is better than the Topping Octo in my opinion. And listen, there's a lot of DAC choices under $2,000 these days, a lot of competition. There are DACs that will give you more kind of warmth. There's more DACs that will give you more of that R2R sound. DACs that will give you more of that tubeness, tube goodness, and so on and so forth. But at the end of the day, I think for someone that's looking for absolute neutrality while still looking for that forgivingness with the detail retrieval, I think the Gustard makes a compelling case here. And personally for me, I think this is perhaps my favorite under $2,000 for those neutral DACs out there that's supposed to be transparent, because this DAC does have that transparency and detail like I said, but the most refined I've heard under $2,000, again, in that category of neutral, transparent, detailed DACs. So now I turn the question back to you for those Gustard lovers out there in the comment section. Did I get it right? Why do you love Gustard DACs? Because after hearing this unit, I think I can understand why, but depending on the unit, it may sound a little bit different. So let me know in the comment section what Gustard DAC you have and what you love about them. So that's pretty much it from me. I hope this video was helpful and entertaining, and if it was, please consider clicking that like button. I know I hate asking for it too every single time, but it does really help my channel out. And if you're feeling extra generous, please consider subscribing as well. It does help my channel out greatly, and you won't miss the next content as well if you're interested in sticking around for future content like this. So thank you for watching, and I hope to see you guys on my next one. Until next time.